Liam stepped into his new apartment, a sense of relief washing over him. The old building, with its Victorian charm and slightly worn edges, felt like a writer's haven, a perfect place for a freelance writer seeking solitude and inspiration. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city where the bustle of urban life seemed like a distant memory. As he unpacked his belongings, Liam admired the high ceilings and the large bay windows that let in generous amounts of sunlight. The wooden floors creaked under his weight, a reminder of the building's age and stories it might hold. The walls, adorned with faded wallpaper depicting scenes of pastoral tranquility, added to the apartment's quaint, if somewhat outdated, charm. That first night, as Liam settled into bed, the silence of the apartment was almost deafening. It was exactly what he had wanted, a peaceful retreat from the noisy, cluttered world outside. He drifted off to sleep, thinking about the novel he planned to start writing, his mind buzzing with ideas and plot lines. In the deep, still hours of the night, a faint sound stirred him from his slumber. Knock, knock, knock. It was soft, barely audible, like someone gently tapping a finger against the wall. Liam lay in bed, still half asleep, assuming it was just the building settling or perhaps the heating pipes acting up. The sound was rhythmic, almost methodical, but it soon faded into the night, and Liam's consciousness slipped back into the depths of sleep. The next morning, Liam awoke feeling refreshed. The knocking had been forgotten, lost in the fog of dreams and the light of day. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, his laptop open in front of him, ready to start on his novel. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the sound from the night before. It was probably nothing, he reassured himself, just an old building showing its age. As he began to write, the quietness of the apartment enveloped him, almost too perfect for someone used to the constant hum of city life. Occasionally, he would stop typing to listen, half expecting to hear the sound again, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, comforting, and solitary atmosphere he had longed for. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Liam heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was more distinct, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the living room wall. Intrigued, Liam walked over and pressed his ear against the cool plaster. The knocks continued, a steady, rhythmic pattern that made no sense. He tapped back, half jokingly, and to his surprise, the knocking paused for a moment before resuming. He froze. It was probably just a quirky pipe or an odd acoustical trick, he reasoned. Yet, as he retired to bed that night, a seed of curiosity had been planted in his mind. What was causing the knocking in his walls? The next day, Liam asked his neighbors about the noises, but they shrugged it off, attributing it to the usual quirks of an old building. The landlord, a gruff man in his 60s, was equally dismissive, assuring Liam that it was nothing to worry about. But that night, as Liam lay in bed, the knocking returned, more persistent than before. It was as if something or someone was trying to communicate from within the walls. His writer's imagination, always ripe with ideas, began to churn with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. As the knocks echoed in the quiet of his apartment, Liam realized that this was just the beginning. As days turned into weeks, the knocking in Liam's apartment grew more frequent and more unsettling. It was no longer a matter of if it would happen, but when. Each night, as darkness enveloped the city, the rhythmic tapping echoed through the walls, punctuating the silence with its cryptic message. Liam found himself growing increasingly obsessed with the sound. It wasn't just random noise. There was a pattern to it, a sequence that repeated itself night after night. It seemed almost like Morse code, a series of taps and pauses that begged to be deciphered. Liam spent hours researching, trying to translate the pattern into something comprehensible, but to no avail. One afternoon, driven by a blend of frustration and curiosity, Liam decided to visit Mrs. Henderson, the elderly lady who lived in the apartment below his. If anyone knew the building's secrets, it would be her. Mrs. Henderson welcomed him in, her apartment a stark contrast to Liam's, filled with photos, memorabilia, and the faint scent of lavender. As they chatted over tea, Liam cautiously brought up the subject of the knocking. To his surprise, Mrs. Henderson's warm demeanor changed instantly. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "You've heard it too, then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She proceeded to tell Liam about the previous tenant of his apartment, a young man who had become so disturbed by the knocking that he left abruptly, leaving most of his belongings behind. That night, Liam lay awake, pondering Mrs. Henderson's story. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea of someone else being driven away by the same sounds that now haunted him. He began scouring the internet for any information about the building, its history, and its previous occupants. As Liam's investigation deepened, so did the intensity of the knocking. It was no longer confined to the walls of his bedroom. It followed him throughout the apartment, a constant, unyielding presence. It seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if demanding his attention. Liam's obsession with the sounds began to isolate him from the world. Friends' calls went unanswered, deadlines were missed, and his once orderly apartment descended into chaos. His nights were consumed by attempts to communicate with whatever was behind the walls, tapping out responses and waiting anxiously for a reply. One particularly sleepless night, as Liam sat hunched over his notes, the knocking pattern shifted dramatically. It was no longer just a series of random taps, but appeared to be a deliberate attempt at communication. Transcribing the pattern led Liam to a bone-chilling realization. The knocks seemed to spell out a desperate plea for help. Determined to uncover the source of the knocking, Liam started to physically examine his apartment. He tapped on every inch of the walls, listening intently for any hollow sound that might reveal a hidden chamber or forgotten passage. As he peeled back layers of the apartment's history, Liam discovered a false wall in the living room. Behind it lay a small, dust-choked room, untouched by time. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with old newspaper clippings, strange diagrams, and frantic, scribbled notes that spoke of rituals, spirits, and a haunting presence within the building. One night, while poring over the cryptic notes and diagrams he had found, Liam experienced a moment of horrifying clarity. The symbols matched those in the writings, and the knocking pattern mirrored the diagram's layout. He realized that the knocking wasn't just a call for help. It was part of a ritual, one that had been left unfinished, and by trying to communicate with it, he had inadvertently become a part of it. He realized he could no longer live under the shadow of the unseen terror that lurked within the walls. In a moment of desperate clarity, Liam decided to confront the source of the knocking. He gathered the cryptic notes and diagrams he had found and began to piece together the unfinished ritual described within. It was a risky plan, but Liam believed it was the only way to end the nightmare. As night fell, Liam started the ritual, following the instructions with trembling hands. The apartment grew unnaturally cold, and the air thickened with an oppressive sense of dread. The knocking reached a fever pitch surrounding him, reverberating through the very foundation of the building. Midway through the ritual, a figure materialized from the wall where the knocking was loudest. It was the spectral form of the reclusive former tenant, his features twisted in anguish and fury. He revealed that he had been trapped in a liminal space, a prisoner of his own making, bound to the building by the unfinished ritual. The specter confessed that the ritual was meant to grant him eternal life, but it had gone awry, trapping him in an endless loop of time and existence, his consciousness bound to the building. The apartment shook as if in the grip of an earthquake, the walls pulsing with an eerie light. Liam chanted the final incantation, his voice barely audible over the din. The specter let out a final ear-piercing scream before dissipating into nothingness. The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. Liam collapsed, exhausted but alive. The weight of the haunting lifted from his shoulders. In the aftermath, Liam moved out of the apartment, leaving the city and its ghosts behind. He found a new place to live, a new community, and slowly began to rebuild his life. However, the experience had changed him. Occasionally, in the stillness of the night, he would pause and listen, half expecting to hear a familiar knock. But it never came. The apartment and its dark legacy were now just a chapter in his past, a haunting memory of the time when he heard knocking in his walls.